Caleb barely looked over his shoulder at the drill pipe before his whole body stiffened. Something was wrong. He dropped into a crouch and, with clear fear on his face, slowly ran his shaking fingers across the cracked surface of the pipe. When he lifted his hand again, his fingertips were smeared with thick, wet mud. Before Caleb could even understand what he was seeing, more mud began forcing its way out around the wellhead. Everyone nearby froze in disbelief. Inside the control room, the crew reacted fast and shut the annular preventer. As the pipe gate closed, the mud rushing up from below was suddenly sealed inside. But out on the platform, chaos had already started. Workers scattered in every direction, trying to get away from the muddy blast. Caleb was knocked down by the force of it, but he quickly scrambled back up and shouted to the control room, asking what he should do next. Jason pointed toward another section of the rig and told him to open the diversion valve on the drill pipe to bleed off the pressure. Caleb didn't waste a second. He pushed through the rain of mud, reached the valve, and turned it with everything he had. The moment he did, the mud finally stopped spraying out, but no one on that rig understood the truth yet. This wasn't the end of the problem. It was only the first warning sign of a disaster that was about to turn into a nightmare. 2 days earlier, the drilling crew had arrived at the heliport, preparing to fly out to the offshore oil platform known as Deepwater Horizon. Like most disasters, the day began almost too calmly, with nothing around them hinting at the destruction waiting ahead. Inside the helicopter, the mood was relaxed. The men laughed, joked, and talked like this was just another normal shift. For most of them, it was routine. They had done this before. But for some of the newer workers, the sight of the giant rig was breathtaking. From the air, the platform looked almost like a massive ship standing in the middle of the ocean. To them, it seemed like a true wonder of engineering. A short time later, the helicopter touched down safely on the platform's helipad. Jimmy, the man responsible for the rig, stepped out and immediately noticed something strange. The logging crew was already getting ready to leave. Jimmy asked them whether the well had been completed, but instead of giving him a straight answer, they acted uncomfortable and avoided the question. Their silence said more than their words could. Since he couldn't get a clear explanation, Jimmy and Mike headed directly to the control room. Mike, the chief electrician, got straight to work and began his routine checks. At first, everything looked normal. The gauges were steady, the systems were functioning properly, and the rig's electrical power appeared to be running without trouble. But then Mike noticed something else. A mud recovery vessel was stationed not far from the platform. That should have meant the early well work had already been wrapped up. The problem was, Jimmy still had not received the cement test results. That missing report was a serious red flag. It suggested that someone had skipped an important safety inspection so the work could move ahead faster. Concerned, Mike went to the main work area and started asking the drillers what had happened. But every driller he spoke to gave the same answer. None of them had performed any cement test. When Mike returned to the control room and questioned Jason, he finally learned what had happened. The BP supervisors had paid the logging team to leave the rig early. Mike immediately reported this to Jimmy, and the two of them decided to confront the BP officials face-to-face. As they walked across the platform, Mike casually tossed a coin into the sea, almost like a habit. The coin disappeared beneath the surface, sinking into the dark water below. But underneath that calm ocean, dangerous pressure was already building. Soon after, Mike and Jimmy met with the BP supervisors. The rig had been leased by BP, and their operation was already nearly 50 days behind schedule. On top of that, the delay had cost them more than $50 million. Because of this, they were desperate to save time, even if it meant cutting corners. But Jimmy refused to accept that. BP may have been paying the bills, but Jimmy was still responsible for the lives of every single person working on that platform. To him, no schedule and no amount of money was worth risking the crew's safety. Because Jimmy stood his ground, Vidrine had no choice but to agree to another pressure test. Following the order, the crew adjusted the platform's direction and prepared the system. Jason closed the annular preventer, sealing the subsea pipe. As the pipe shut beneath the ocean, the mud inside began moving rapidly through the system. Everyone watched the gauges during the negative pressure test. Vidrine was visibly tense, because he knew that if the test failed, the delay could cost BP tens of millions more. For a few minutes they waited. Then the pressure reading shifted and settled at around 100 pounds per square inch. That number was considered safe, and for a brief moment, it looked like the well had passed. But just when they were ready to believe everything was under control, bubbles began rising from the seabed. Then the pressure gauge suddenly climbed to nearly 500, and it didn't stop there. As more bubbles broke the surface, the reading jumped from 450 to 900. Within seconds, it shot past the red line and reached 1,395. The meaning was clear. The pressure had gone far beyond the safe limit, but Vidrine refused to accept that conclusion. He argued that the reading didn't make sense. If the pressure inside the pipe was really that high, then mud should have been coming out of the drill pipe. But nothing was flowing. Jimmy and Mike couldn't immediately explain the contradiction either. Trying to defend his theory, Vidrine drew a quick diagram. He suggested that maybe the high pressure was trapped only in one small section near the preventer. According to him, that isolated pocket could be pressing directly against the sensor, making the gauge spike, while the rest of the pipe remained stable. That would explain why the pressure reading looked dangerous even though no mud was coming out. Vidrine then recommended running a second pressure test, this time through the kill line connected to the drill pipe. In his mind, that would settle the argument. If the kill line showed the same pressure, then the danger was real. But if it showed nothing, then the problem was probably just a bad sensor giving a false reading. His explanation sounded reasonable enough. At least on the surface, it did. Jimmy and Mike didn't have a clear counterargument at that moment. The truth was, none of them could actually see what was happening deep below the ocean floor. All they had to rely on were gauges, numbers, and whatever the equipment was telling them. So even though Jimmy still didn't feel comfortable, he finally allowed Vidrine to go ahead with the second test. But beneath the rig, the situation was becoming more unstable by the second. Down on the seabed, the pressure was growing violent. Mud, gas, and broken rock were being forced upward with terrifying strength. At first, the kill line test showed pressure somewhere around 500. But then pieces of debris suddenly blocked part of the pipe. The moment that happened, the gauge reading dropped straight to zero, and for Vidrine, that was exactly the result he needed. To everyone watching from above, it looked like his theory had been proven correct. The kill line showed no pressure, so they assumed the earlier reading had been misleading. But what none of them understood was that the zero reading wasn't a sign of safety. It was the result of something far more dangerous happening inside the system. A few moments later, Jimmy received the update. Kill line pressure was at zero. He still looked uneasy. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. But the numbers were there, and with no solid proof against them, he gave the approval to continue. With Jimmy's permission, Jason reopened the annular preventer. The mud that had been trapped below immediately began rushing upward again. Inside the control room, the crew started diverting the flow, removing the drilling mud that had been helping hold the pressure in balance. And with that decision, the final barrier protecting the rig was opened. Within minutes, the pressure climbed back into the danger zone. Jason watched the gauge rise past 23.0, and he had no choice but to stop the mud transfer immediately. While everyone tried to understand why the readings were going wild again, Caleb, working outside, noticed that something was badly wrong. This was the moment that led directly back to the opening scene. From here, the deep-sea incident began transforming into a full-scale catastrophe. At first, it looked like the blowout had been brought under control, but below the rig, the ocean floor released an even stronger burst of energy. High-pressure rock and mud slammed through the system with such force that the annular preventer began to break apart. The mud could no longer be held back. It tore through the pipes and rushed straight into the diversion chamber. Workers nearby heard strange noises coming from the valve area. They turned toward it, confused and alarmed. Then, in the next instant, mud exploded out through the cracks. When Andrea saw the alarm, she initially thought it might just be another routine system warning. She didn't panic right away, but when she tried calling for confirmation, no one picked up because everyone near the equipment was already fighting desperately to shut the valves. One of the older, more experienced workers immediately understood what was happening. He kept shouting for everyone to get out because he knew this wasn't a small malfunction. This was the start of something catastrophic. And the pressure gauge climbing past 4,000 proved him right. Jason ordered the crew to close the second blowout preventer, but under that kind of extreme pressure, even that system could only slow the disaster down for a short time. It couldn't truly stop it. Mud blasted across the area again, knocking Caleb and the others around. Using the brief window they had, they scrambled away from the danger zone and tried to escape. By now, the activity beneath the seabed had fully erupted. The workers in the diversion chamber were the first to experience the full force of the ocean roaring up through the rig. Caleb wanted to do something, but in that kind of high-pressure mud flow, rescue work was impossible. He tried more than once to push forward, but the violent current hit like a solid wall. Worse, chunks of rock from below were shooting through the area like bullets. Seeing how dangerous it had become, Jason called Caleb and ordered him to leave immediately. Meanwhile, the mud recovery vessel stationed nearby finally realized something had gone terribly wrong on the platform. Someone stepped onto the deck and raised a pair of binoculars to see what was happening. But before he could fully process the scene, a Pelican drenched in crude oil suddenly crashed into the wheelhouse. The sight left everyone on the vessel speechless. Back on the platform, the central work area had descended into complete chaos. Mud was everywhere, smashing through equipment and tearing apart anything in its path. Jason shouted for the pipe to be cut, but before the worker could act, a powerful shockwave knocked him straight to the floor. Elsewhere, Mike was on a video call with his wife when the strange noise reached him. He froze, confused, trying to understand what he had just heard. Vidrine, who had barely escaped the earlier blast, stood motionless in shock. His face said everything. He had no idea what to do. His mind had gone completely blank. The blowout was now carrying huge amounts of crude oil along with it. Oil vapors began flooding into the platform's intake vents. From there, the fumes spread through the internal pipelines and reached the engines. That caused the thrusters to suddenly speed up. The entire platform began shifting out of position, but the drill pipe still had not been cut. The rig remained physically connected to the seabed, so when the platform moved, the pipe was forced to bend. And once the pipe bent, the existing cracks opened even wider. The pressure escaping through the system became even more violent. Andrea saw the screens filling with error messages and alarms. She stepped out of the power room to check the situation for herself, and the sight in front of her left her completely stunned. She rushed back inside and immediately called for help. Soon after, the Coast Guard received the distress signal. They checked satellite images of the incident and quickly confirmed that something serious had happened on the offshore platform. The commander wasted no time and began coordinating rescue units in the area, but there was one major problem. The rig was far out at sea. Even a helicopter would need more than 30 minutes to reach the platform. A firefighting vessel would take even longer. By this point, the entire drilling platform was being swallowed by fire. A short distance away, the mud recovery vessel quickly pulled out whatever rescue equipment it had available. Their resources were limited, but there was no time to wait. Crew members immediately launched lifeboats and moved toward the burning rig to begin pulling survivors out. Back on the platform, Jimmy, badly injured and barely conscious, slowly began to wake up. His body was in terrible shape, but he forced himself to move. He got dressed, staggered out of the room, and stepped into a scene that looked nothing like the rig he knew. Outside, he spotted Mike searching through the wreckage for trapped workers. Mike had been hit by a door during the explosion, but luckily, he had escaped without any life-threatening injuries. Jimmy told him to take him to the control room. As the man in charge, Jimmy knew he still had one critical responsibility left. With his highest-level authority, he had to cut the drill pipe and separate the rig from the nightmare erupting beneath it. As Mike helped him move through the damaged platform, they came across more workers trapped in different sections. They stopped to rescue whoever they could, even as fresh explosions kept tearing through the rig around them. Every few moments, another blast shook the steel structure, until finally the entire platform lost power. Even so, they managed to get those trapped workers out alive. Meanwhile, Vidrine stood frozen in place, staring at the burning wreckage as if his mind had completely shut down. The platform looked like the end of the world, and he had no idea where to go or what to do. Eventually, he walked into the control room, but the people inside had no answers either. They only looked at one another in silence, overwhelmed by the disaster unfolding around them. At the lifeboat station, the first group of workers was preparing to evacuate, but directly above them, a crane had malfunctioned and was swinging wildly, crashing again and again into the metal frame. If that crane broke loose and fell, everyone sitting in the lifeboat below would be crushed. Seeing the danger, the crane operator made a brave decision. With flames raging around him, he climbed into the crane cab and tried to regain control. The weight on the crane was enormous, and the axle was almost locked in place. Still, he fought with all his strength to hold it steady. For a brief second, the workers below cheered, believing he had saved them. But the celebration didn't last. In the next instant, his fate was sealed. Elsewhere, Mike finally helped Jimmy reach the control room. When Jimmy realized Vidrine was there too, his anger exploded. Even though Jimmy could barely see, he confronted him furiously, knowing the decisions made earlier had helped lead them into this disaster. After Vidrine left, Jimmy had someone guide his hand toward the pipe-cutting controls. Then with one push of the button, two massive blades inside the drill pipe activated and drove outward. But the cut failed. The others immediately wanted to abandon the control room and evacuate, but Jimmy refused to give up yet. He believed they had to restore power, because without power the platform would keep drifting and become even more unstable. So Mike and Caleb headed toward the power room, running straight through the burning wreckage. Outside, sparks rained around them from every direction. The heat was so intense it felt like the air itself had caught fire. Then, without warning, a huge fireball burst near them, almost ending their lives on the spot. Somehow they made it inside the power room. Following the emergency manual step by step, Mike worked fast and managed to bring electricity back to the platform. The lights flickered, then returned. Systems started coming back online, and for a short time, the platform's movement became more stable. But against a disaster of this size, that small victory barely mattered. Moments later, another explosion struck, throwing both Mike and Caleb into danger again. When Jimmy and the others finally came outside, they saw that the last available lifeboat was already packed with survivors and had pulled away from the platform. Behind them, the rig was still exploding over and over, and it was obvious the whole structure would not survive much longer before becoming a twisted pile of metal. Mike quickly gathered the remaining workers and organized them around an inflatable raft. He told everyone else to get on first, making it clear that he would stay behind until the others were safe. But before they could fully launch it, another blast threw Mike and Andrea across the deck. The worker handling the raft's descent was suddenly caught in flames. Panicking, he jumped into the ocean, and the inflatable raft dropped down to the water below. But there was another horrifying problem. The sea around the platform was burning. Jumping straight down into that fire-covered water would almost certainly kill them. Mike immediately grabbed Andrea and pulled her toward higher ground. He understood that their only chance was to jump from a higher point, far enough out to clear the flames and land in a safer section of the water. Soon, they reached the helipad. Behind them, the Deepwater horizon had become a giant burning monster, a steel volcano roaring in the middle of the ocean, ready to consume anything still standing on it. Mike tried to keep Andrea focused while helping her put on a life jacket, but when she looked down and froze in terror, she couldn't bring herself to jump. There was no more time. Mike pushed her. A moment later, he jumped after her, plunging into the dark ocean below. He surfaced and quickly searched for Andrea until he found her. Just then, rescue boats arrived and pulled them both from the water. On the nearby mud recovery vessel, Jimmy began calling out names one by one, trying to account for every worker. Some men answered, but some names were met only with silence. Only after Mike and Andrea were brought aboard did the rescue helicopter finally arrive, taking the most seriously injured survivors away from the scene. By then, the drilling platform had completely transformed into a blazing inferno. Later, Mike and the others were taken back to the city. They had survived, but the horror of what they had seen still clung to them. Their bodies were safe, but their minds were still trapped on that burning rig. Soon, Mike's wife and daughter arrived at the hotel. After everything that had happened, simply being alive felt like a miracle. As Mike's family walked into the lobby, Andrea stepped forward and hugged him tightly. Nearby, Caleb's family wore the same expression, a mixture of relief, shock, and gratitude that their loved one had made it home. At the entrance, Mike saw Jimmy, wounded and exhausted but alive. Mike and his family embraced him one by one before finally saying goodbye. The film is based on a true story. The Deepwater Horizon disaster took the lives of 11 workers. The blowout continued for 87 days, and around 210 million gallons of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. To this day, it remains the worst oil spill disaster in United States history. When people talk about Deepwater Horizon, most of the time they remember the oil spill first. And honestly, that makes sense. The images were everywhere: fire on the water, black oil spreading across the Gulf of Mexico, wildlife covered in crude, BP getting dragged through the headlines, and this horrible sense that something had gone wrong on a scale nobody could easily clean up. But Peter Berg's film does something slightly different. It doesn't begin as a big environmental documentary. It doesn't start by giving us charts, lawsuits, political arguments, or a full breakdown of the aftermath. Instead, it pulls the camera closer, much closer. It takes us back to April 2010, onto the Deepwater Horizon oil rig itself, and tries to show what happened before the disaster became a national headline. That's the part that makes the movie interesting right away, because for a lot of people, the Deepwater Horizon tragedy exists in memory as this massive oil spill. But the film reminds us that before it became an environmental catastrophe, it was also a workplace disaster. There were real men and women on that rig, people doing their jobs, people calling home, people joking with coworkers, people trusting that the machinery around them and the people making decisions above them would not put their lives in danger. And of course, that trust was broken. The movie is set in the Gulf of Mexico, where the Deepwater Horizon rig is working on a deepwater drilling operation for BP. At first, everything feels almost routine. Workers arrive. Conversations happen. The crew gets back into the rhythm of the job. But underneath all of that, there's this quiet unease. You can feel the film telling you, not too loudly, but clearly enough, that something is off. And that's where the tension comes from. We already know this is not going to end well. The film knows we know. So every small warning sign starts to feel heavier. every rushed decision feels sharper. Every safety concern that gets brushed aside lands with this uncomfortable weight, because we're watching people walk toward a disaster that history has already recorded. That's what gives Deepwater Horizon its strongest hook. It is not just asking, what happened? It is asking us to sit with the dread of watching preventable danger build in real time. And even before the explosions, even before the fire, even before the rig turns into a nightmare of mud, smoke, and metal, the film already has a pulse. Because the real horror here is not just that something went wrong, it's that people saw warning signs, and the machine kept moving anyway. The basic setup of Deepwater Horizon is simple on paper, but the situation underneath it is anything but simple. We're on an offshore drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The rig has been hired for deepwater drilling, and the job is already behind schedule. That detail matters, because from the beginning, the movie makes it clear that time is not just time here. Time is money. Every delay costs somebody something. And when a company starts looking at safety through the lens of cost, well, that's where the whole thing begins to feel dangerous before anything has even exploded. The crew arrives like this is just another work rotation. Mike Williams comes aboard. Jimmy Harrell is already carrying that old-school supervisor energy, the kind of guy who doesn't need to shout to make you feel. He knows the place better than anyone in the room. The workers settle into their normal rhythm. People talk, joke, check equipment, move through routines. It feels like a real job site, not some shiny Hollywood version of one, but very quickly there's friction. A safety team has left before completing certain checks. The pressure tests don't feel right. The numbers don't sit comfortably with the people who actually have to work on the rig. And then you have the BP representatives, especially Donald Vidrine, pushing things forward with that quiet corporate confidence that always sounds reasonable until you realize what it's risking. That's really the premise. A group of workers can sense something is wrong, but the people controlling the schedule want the operation to continue. And the movie doesn't treat this like a mystery. We're not sitting there wondering whether the rig will be fine. We know what's coming. The tension comes from watching the steps toward it, the ignored warnings, the arguments over tests, the little decisions that don't look catastrophic in isolation, but start piling up into something awful. For the first stretch, Deepwater Horizon is not really an explosion movie yet. It's a pressure movie, literally and dramatically. Pressure under the ocean floor, pressure inside the equipment, pressure from management. Pressure on workers who know that one wrong call-out there doesn't just mean a bad day at work. It means people may not go home. And once the disaster finally breaks open, the film shifts from workplace tension into survival chaos. The rig becomes fire, mud, smoke, alarms, broken metal, and people desperately trying to find a way out. But the reason that second half works is because the premise has already been planted. This was not just a random accident. This was a job where warning signs were there, safety was questioned, and the push to keep moving became more important than stopping to ask, are we about to make a terrible mistake? One of the things that hits you immediately about Deepwater Horizon is that this isn't just a disaster movie made up in a writer's head. You already know it happened. You remember the images, the news clips, the headlines screaming about millions of gallons of oil, blackened waters, and the lives lost. That's the first thing Berg leans into. He doesn't need to explain why it matters. The audience already carries that weight, and that changes the way you watch the movie. There's no mystery. You're not sitting there wondering if something bad might happen. You know it will. The tension comes from seeing how it happens, from watching these men and women go about their jobs, doing everything they can, knowing deep down that the disaster is creeping closer with every skipped test and every hurried decision. That true story foundation gives the film an almost unavoidable emotional pull. Every joke, every small interaction, every mundane task aboard the rig carries this shadow. Because when you know the outcome, even a casual glance at a gauge or a hurried conversation about a pressure reading suddenly feels terrifying. It's also what makes the movie feel real in a way that pure fiction can't. The explosions, the fire, the chaos, they aren't just spectacle. They're grounded in reality, and knowing that people actually lived through it, or didn't, gives every frame an edge you can't fake. Sure, you could argue that this also limits the film in some ways. Since you know the ending, Berg can't surprise you with the what-if tension that a fictional disaster might offer. But that's also the brilliance of using a real event. The dread is constant. You're waiting for the inevitable, and because it really happened, every second of buildup feels like walking a tightrope over a pit you know is waiting. That's why, for me, the true story angle is the heartbeat of the movie. It's not just a story about fire, mud, and explosions. It's a story about real people, real mistakes, and real consequences, and you feel every bit of that in a way no fiction alone could deliver. If there's one character the movie really leans on to guide you through all this chaos, it's Mike Williams, played by Mark Wahlberg. And honestly, that makes sense. He's the guy we can follow, the one whose eyes the audience shares, and he's supposed to carry you from the slow-building tension straight into the inferno. Mike's not some larger-than-life action hero. He's not giving speeches or making dramatic proclamations. He's the chief electronics technician, a guy who knows the machinery, understands the rig, and cares about the people around him. He's practical, capable, and crucially human. You can feel the stress in his face, the worry for his colleagues, the tug of responsibility pressing down on him while he's trying to do a normal job in a very abnormal situation. And Berg does something smart here. We see Mike in both worlds. On shore, he has a wife and daughter waiting, which makes every small risk feel personal. On the rig, he's part of a team, and the audience can see him navigating routines, reading gauges, noticing problems, and quietly pushing against bad decisions. We get a sense of what it feels like to be in that position, trapped between human instinct and corporate pressure. That said, the movie does lean hard on Mike. By the second half, when everything is going sideways, he's front and center for much of the survival story. That's fine for a narrative anchor, but it also flattens some of the other crew members. We care about Mike, and we should, but sometimes it feels like the other people on the rig fade into background noise while he becomes the emotional barometer for the audience. Still, Wahlberg does a solid job. There's sincerity to his performance, and he brings a kind of grounded normalcy that keeps the audience invested. He's not overacting, not trying to be some exaggerated hero. He's just a man caught in a nightmare, doing what he can to survive and help others. And honestly, that's enough to make the experience hit harder. In a movie like this, having a central viewpoint matters. Otherwise, all the chaos can feel distant or abstract. With Mike Williams as our anchor, you're not just watching explosions on a rig. You're watching someone live through it, someone whose fear, determination, and occasional helplessness give the story a human pulse. And that pulse is what carries you into the fire. Before the movie ever gets to the rig, Deepwater Horizon spends a little time with Mike Williams at home. And yeah, on one level, you can feel the movie doing the usual disaster film setup. Here's the husband, here's the wife, here's the daughter, here's the ordinary morning before everything goes wrong. It's not exactly a new trick. We've seen this kind of emotional groundwork before, but I don't think it's useless. Kate Hudson plays Felicia, Mike's wife, and those early scenes are there to remind us that these workers don't just exist on the rig. They have homes, families, routines, little conversations before work, people waiting for them to call back. That sounds basic, but in a movie built around machinery, pressure tests, explosions, and corporate decisions, that little bit of domestic life gives the story a human scale. Mike isn't just a technician walking into danger. He's a father leaving his daughter behind for another shift. He's a husband saying goodbye like it's any other day. And that's the part that quietly stings, because of course for him, it is just another day. He doesn't walk out of the house like a man heading into history. He walks out like a guy going to work. That detail matters. The film uses his family as emotional weight later, especially when the disaster starts, and we know there are people on shore who have no control over anything happening out there. They can't help, they can't reach him. They can only wait, and that waiting adds a different kind of pressure to the survival story. Now, is it a little familiar? Absolutely. The wife and child setup is very much disaster movie language. Sometimes it feels like the film is placing those pieces exactly where you expect them, so later it can pull on that emotional thread. You can almost sense the movie saying, remember what he has to come home to. But even if it's familiar, it still works because the situation is real. These weren't imaginary action heroes with imaginary families. These were workers with actual lives outside that rig, so the family scenes may be conventional, but they also serve a purpose. They bring the tragedy back down from the size of a national headline to the size of one living room, one goodbye, one family waiting for news. And in a film full of fire, mud, metal, and corporate blame, that small reminder is important. Because every person on that rig had a life outside the frame. Mike's family scenes are just the movie's way of letting us feel that before everything goes dark. Then there's Jimmy Harrell, played by Kurt Russell, and honestly, he's the guy who keeps the movie grounded. Jimmy isn't flashy. He doesn't make speeches or try to steal the spotlight. He's the supervisor, experienced, cautious, the kind of man who has seen enough rigs and enough small mistakes to know when a problem could become a catastrophe. From the moment he boards, you can tell he's the guy paying attention, not just to the gauges and the equipment, but to the people around him. He notices the little things, the skipped steps, the rushed decisions. And he's not afraid to push back. Russell carries that authority effortlessly. You don't need him to yell or storm around the rig to feel it. He has this weight, this quiet command, the kind of presence that makes you trust his judgment even before disaster strikes. You can see why the crew listens to him, even when management is pressing on. What's great about Jimmy is that he represents caution in a world obsessed with speed and profit. He's the human embodiment of something's wrong here, and the film leans on that to build tension. Every glance at a gauge, every hesitant check, every raised eyebrow at a BP representative, it's all subtle, but it adds to this feeling of impending doom. And it works because Russell makes him feel real. He's not a superhero. He's not perfect. He's practical, knowledgeable, and concerned. And when the disaster finally hits, it's that experience, that attentiveness, that lets him survive longer and help others. Jimmy Harrell is the quiet conscience of the film, the person you believe when he says, "Stop, this isn't safe." And in a movie full of explosions, chaos, and corporate negligence, that kind of presence is crucial. He's the anchor amid all the fire and smoke, the guy who reminds you that sometimes knowing what's right isn't enough to stop the consequences. And then you have Donald Vidrine, played by John Malkovich, the guy who's basically the human face of BP's corporate pressure. Vidrine is one of those characters who immediately makes you uneasy. He's calm, collected, polite even, but you can feel the priorities shifting underneath every word he says. Deadlines, schedules, money, that's what drives him. Safety. That's a suggestion at best, and Berg leans into that without subtlety. Every time he appears, you're aware that the rig's well-being is secondary to the spreadsheet. Malkovich doesn't just play a villain yelling orders. No, he's smarter than that. He's the type who rationalizes shortcuts, justifies risks, and convinces himself that what he's doing is reasonable. You can see him thinking, sure, it might be dangerous, but it's cheaper this way. We'll be fine, and of course the tension comes from knowing he's wrong. We know it, the workers know it, but he doesn't. That's what makes the character fascinating. He's not a cartoon villain. He's corporate logic personified. Polite, calm, strategic, and frustratingly confident. And yet, as the movie unfolds, you start to see cracks. When the rig explodes, when the chaos hits, the confidence evaporates. Suddenly, he's just another human being caught in consequences he thought he could control. Vidrine and BP management in general are the reason the tension exists in the first place. They're the push against the safety-conscious crew, the people who dismiss concerns, the ones who make decisions based on bottom lines rather than lives. And the film makes that very clear, sometimes too clear, honestly, but it works. It gives you someone to be mad at, someone to blame, and it drives the entire build-up to disaster. In a story about a preventable catastrophe, Vidrine isn't just a character. He's the embodiment of that preventable element, the corporate edge that cuts through caution, pushes schedules, and ultimately lights the fuse. And Malkovich sells it perfectly, calm and almost charming, until you realize just how dangerous that calm really is. The real engine of Deepwater Horizon is not the explosion. It's the decision-making that leads to it. That's what makes the film uncomfortable long before the rig catches fire. The danger doesn't arrive out of nowhere. It builds through pressure, corporate pressure, schedule pressure, financial pressure, all of it slowly pushing safety into the corner. BP, as the movie presents it, is not just impatient. It's careless in that very polished corporate way where nobody wants to say, "Let's risk lives," but somehow the conversation keeps landing there anyway. Tests are questioned. Warning signs are brushed aside. Delays are treated like personal insults to the budget, and the men actually standing on the rig, the ones who would have to live with the consequences, are the ones being told to keep moving. That's the ugly thing the film keeps circling. When money becomes the loudest voice in the room, safety starts sounding like an inconvenience. And honestly, that part hits hard, because this isn't framed as some freak accident where nature simply turned violent. The movie wants you to feel that this could have been avoided. It wants you angry at the shortcuts, at the arrogance, at the way human life gets quietly measured against lost time and rising costs. It's not subtle about it, but maybe it doesn't need to be. Some disasters don't need poetic interpretation. Sometimes the point really is that people knew better and pushed forward anyway. The BP representatives look at the delay and see wasted money. The crew looks at the same situation and sees danger. That contrast is simple, but effective. It creates a kind of moral tension that runs through the entire first half. Every time a concern is dismissed, the audience feels the disaster getting closer. What's especially frustrating is how ordinary the negligence feels. It's not presented like one huge evil decision. It's smaller than that and in some ways more believable. A skipped check here, a rushed conversation there, a test result explained away because accepting it would mean stopping the job. That's how the movie shows corporate greed, not as a dramatic speech, but as a series of practical-sounding choices that become deadly when stacked together. And by the time everything goes wrong, the anger is already there. The fire is horrifying, of course. The explosions are terrifying. But the thing that really stays with you is the knowledge that this was not simply bad luck. It was the result of people treating caution like a cost problem. That's where Deepwater Horizon finds its sharpest edge. Underneath the disaster spectacle, it is a film about what happens when the bottom line wins the argument, and in this case, the price was paid in lives. One thing that really struck me about Deepwater Horizon is how clearly it draws the lines between good and bad. It's not subtle. The rig workers are the good guys, practical, hardworking, conscientious. They notice problems, raise concerns, try to keep things safe. They're human, flawed, but fundamentally decent. And then there's BP, represented by people like Donald Vidrine, who are, well, the opposite. Calculating, calm, money-driven, dismissive of safety concerns. The movie makes it obvious who the audience is supposed to side with. Some might say that's a bit simplistic, and yeah, it is. Real disasters are rarely that neat. Responsibility usually spreads across systems, protocols, training, and sometimes sheer bad luck. But here, Berg doesn't complicate the moral picture. You instantly know who you're rooting for and who you're quietly getting frustrated with. And that works in a weird way, because by the time the explosion hits, you already care about the crew. You've seen the dismissals, the skipped tests, the tension between experience and corporate greed. So when things go wrong, it hits hard, emotionally and morally. You feel the injustice, the human cost of those decisions. It may be simplified, but it's also honest. The movie wants to show that sometimes disasters aren't just tragic accidents. They're preventable, and preventable disasters have faces you can recognize. And for all the chaos, explosions, and survival drama that follows, that moral clarity gives the audience a reason to care beyond the spectacle. In other words, it's not trying to be a nuanced corporate thriller. It's trying to make you feel the weight of greed, the pressure of shortcuts, and the cost of ignoring warnings, and in that, it succeeds. One of the trickiest parts of Deepwater Horizon is that it's really trying to show you what it's like to work on a deepwater oil rig, and that world is complicated, really complicated. You've got pressure tests, cement integrity checks, sensors, gauges, marine risers, blowout preventers, drilling mud, methane gas, the list goes on. Even for someone who's vaguely familiar with how rigs work, it's a lot to take in. And for the average viewer, it can feel like you're staring at a foreign language while everyone around you nods along. Berg does try to help. There's the little visual explanations, like the soda, an analogy for pressure. Little touches meant to make it intuitive. And watching the crew walk through procedures, checking gauges, discussing readings, it gives the sense that these are real people doing real, high-stakes technical work. But honestly, even with that, it can get confusing. There are moments where you might not fully understand why opening the well was a problem, or why one reading freaks people out while another doesn't. That's partly the point. The danger is invisible until it's too late, but it does make the first half of the film feel dense at times. Still, there's something immersive about seeing it all laid out. Even if you don't catch every technical detail, you feel the weight of it. The complexity of the machinery, the precision required, the tightrope they're walking, it all contributes to that growing sense of dread. And once the disaster begins, every bit of that technical setup pays off, because you suddenly realize how small mistakes, skipped steps, or ignored warnings can turn into full-blown catastrophe. In the end, the technical stuff isn't just background detail. It's the ticking clock, the hidden threat, the reason why this explosion isn't just dramatic, it's terrifyingly believable. One thing that's worth pointing out about Deepwater Horizon is that, for all its intensity later, the movie isn't always easy to follow early on. There's a lot of technical jargon thrown at you. Pressure tests, cementing, blowout preventers, risers, mud, sensors. It's like a crash course in oil rig operations delivered at full speed. And honestly, sometimes it feels like you need a cheat sheet just to keep up. Berg does try to explain things here and there. A soda can analogy, or showing someone checking a gauge, or a brief line of dialogue that hints at what's at stake, but it's still a lot. Sometimes you don't fully get why a particular reading matters, or why skipping one test is catastrophic. You just feel that tension mounting, and hope that the audience doesn't need to understand every single detail to feel the danger. And that's the tricky balance. On one hand, the technical language makes it feel authentic. This is a specialized, high-stakes world, and the people who live in it have their own language and routines. On the other hand, for viewers like me, it can get confusing. You're trying to track the crew, follow the procedures, and understand the risks, all while the story is building to the explosion. Sometimes that confusion works in the film's favor. You sense that something is wrong, even if you don't fully understand how the machinery works. That mirrors the crew's own experience. They know the warning signs, but the complexity makes it hard to fully convince others to take action. Other times, it slows the first half down. The exposition is heavy, dense, and can feel like a lecture instead of drama. But you stick with it because the tension is palpable, and once the disaster hits, all that technical setup suddenly matters. Every gauge ignored, every shortcut taken, every skipped procedure, you start to see why it all built towards something this catastrophic. So yes, it's a little jargon heavy and sometimes confusing. But by the time the rig goes up in flames, you understand why the movie bothered with all that talk about cement, sensors, and pressure. It's what makes the explosion feel inevitable, and that's what keeps you on the edge of your seat. There's another way to look at the confusion in Deepwater Horizon, though. Maybe we're not supposed to understand every single technical detail. And I know that sounds like an excuse, but hear me out. The movie throws around all this oil rig language, pressure readings, cement tests, mud, sensors, equipment failures, and for a normal viewer, a lot of it goes over your head. But weirdly, that doesn't completely break the film. Because even when you don't understand the exact mechanics, you understand the mood. You understand that something is wrong. You understand that the workers are worried. You understand that the people who should slow everything down are being pushed to keep moving. And maybe that's enough. In a way, the confusion almost puts you in the position of someone standing near a machine they don't fully understand, but can clearly tell it's making the wrong sound. You don't need to know every internal piece to feel the danger. You just need to see the looks on the crew's faces. You need to hear the hesitation in their voices. You need to notice how the room changes when a test result doesn't sit right. That's where the film finds a strange kind of realism. A deepwater oil rig is not a simple place. It's not supposed to feel easy. It's a massive, dangerous, technical environment where small readings can mean life or death, and where the wrong interpretation can become catastrophic. So when the movie makes you feel a little lost, part of that actually adds to the tension. You're not calmly observing from above. You're inside the uncertainty. Now, does that mean the film explains everything perfectly? No, not really. There are still moments where a clearer line or two would have helped. Sometimes the jargon feels less like realism and more like the movie hoping we'll just accept that smart people are worried. But the emotional clarity is always there. The audience may not know the full science, but we know enough to feel the pressure rising. And that's what matters for the drama, because Deepwater Horizon is not asking us to pass an oil drilling exam. It's asking us to sit in that uncomfortable space where danger is building, the experts are uneasy, and the people with power are acting like everything is manageable. That's a very specific kind of fear, not the fear of a monster jumping out. The fear of watching professionals realize something is wrong and still being forced forward. The first half of Deepwater Horizon is basically the movie tightening a bolt one turn at a time. It doesn't rush straight to the explosion. And honestly, that patience is important. Before the rig becomes fire and smoke, the film wants us to sit in the ordinary rhythm of the place. Workers arrive, people joke around, equipment gets checked. Conversations drift between personal stuff, technical stuff, and the kind of workplace complaining that feels familiar even if you've never stepped foot on an oil rig. At first, nothing looks especially dramatic. But that's what makes it uncomfortable. The tension starts in small ways. A safety team has left earlier than expected. Certain tests haven't been done. Jimmy Harrell doesn't like what he's hearing. The BP men are acting like delays are the real emergency. And the crew, even when they're not panicking, seem to understand that something about the situation is off. That slow build gives the movie its first layer of dread. You're watching people go through the motions of a normal workday, but because you already know the history, every little warning sign feels louder than it should. A pressure reading isn't just a pressure reading. A disagreement in a meeting isn't just workplace tension. A skipped procedure isn't just a shortcut. It's another step toward disaster. What I like about this section is that it lets the rig feel alive before it becomes a nightmare. You get the sense of a real place with routines, hierarchy, friendships, frustrations, and people who know their jobs. That matters, because if the film opened with chaos immediately, the destruction would be loud but not personal. The build-up gives the later disaster something to destroy. Now, is it always gripping? Not completely. There are moments where the technical talk gets heavy, and the film maybe lingers longer than it needs to, but the atmosphere works. The dread is there, quietly growing under the surface, and that's the key. The first half isn't about spectacle, it's about pressure. Pressure in the well, pressure from BP, pressure on the crew, pressure in the audience because we're waiting for the moment when all these ignored warnings finally turn into something nobody can control. By the time the rig finally erupts, the movie has already done the important work. It has made the explosion feel less like a sudden disaster scene and more like the terrible result of everything we just watched being dismissed. Okay, now let's talk about pacing in that first half because it's a little tricky. Deepwater Horizon spends a long time setting up the story. You get the crew, you get the routines, the banter, the equipment checks, the meetings about schedules, and the tension between management and workers. On one hand, I get why Berg does this. It's all about making you care before the disaster hits. You need to know who these people are, what's at stake, and why every skipped test or ignored warning matters. But here's the thing. For some viewers, it drags. It's talky, slow, and at times overly procedural. There are moments when it feels like you're just waiting for something to happen, and honestly, you are. A lot of the early technical dialogue can feel heavy-handed, and not every character introduced sticks in your memory, so when chaos finally erupts, it can be hard to keep track. Still, I'll give it this. The slow pacing does build tension if you let it. Every skipped step, every dismissed concern, every glance at a suspicious gauge quietly piles onto that sense of impending doom. You may roll your eyes a little at the exposition-heavy sections, but by the time the explosion actually hits, all that time spent in normalcy pays off. You feel the loss, the danger, the frustration, the "why didn't anyone listen" energy. So yes, the first half can feel slow and even a bit dense, but it's also necessary. It's the pressure cooker part of the story. It's where the tension simmers, the stakes are quietly explained, and your connection to the crew is forged. Without it, the second half might just feel like random fire and chaos instead of a catastrophe that could have been prevented. It's a delicate balance, and Berg walks that line. Some moments drag, sure, but they're there to make the explosion hit that much harder when it finally does. One of the things I really liked about Deepwater Horizon is how it shows life on the rig before everything goes to hell. It's not just a place where people work, it's almost like a small floating community. You see the crew joking around, teasing each other, arguing over minor things, doing their daily routines. They know each other's habits, their quirks, their skills. That little camaraderie, those casual interactions, make the crew feel real. You believe these are people who have spent hours and days together in tight quarters, and that makes the disaster that much more terrifying. Even small touches, someone making a cup of coffee, the way they handle equipment, the way they call out to each other on the deck, add layers of authenticity. It's easy to forget in a disaster movie that before the chaos, there's a rhythm, a life that's ordinary and mundane. Berg captures that. The rig feels lived in. You can imagine these workers doing this job week in and week out. That's why when the explosion hits, it's not just destruction of metal and fire. It's the rupture of a small, functioning society. You've already invested in these people. You've seen them joke, care for one another, and quietly handle danger day to day. So when the alarms go off, when fire and smoke fill the rig, you feel the weight. You know who's at risk, and it makes the panic, the bravery, and the loss hit harder. It also helps that these moments of camaraderie aren't overly sentimental. The film doesn't pause to lecture you on team spirit. You just see it, feel it, and then the contrast with the coming disaster is devastating. It's that ordinary human rhythm of work and friendship that makes the chaos that much more terrifying and emotionally impactful. Here's the thing about Deepwater Horizon. The main characters land pretty solidly, but a lot of the supporting cast ends up a little thin. Mark Wahlberg as Mike Williams and Kurt Russell as Jimmy Harrell are both easy to latch onto. You get them, you understand their concerns, you feel their worry and determination. They're grounded, believable, and carry the emotional weight of the story. The rest of the crew, they're harder to keep straight. There's Gina Rodriguez, Dylan O'Brien, Stella Allen, and a few others who pop in and out of the narrative. You can see the effort to make them feel like real people, and sometimes it works, their banter, the small tasks, the teamwork. But when the disaster hits, it's easy to lose track of who's who. Faces are covered in soot, mud, and flames, and suddenly the individuality of the supporting cast fades. It's not that these characters aren't important. Their presence adds to the realism and gives the sense of a fully staffed rig. But the film doesn't always give them arcs or moments to make you care about them individually. You care about the group collectively, and you care deeply about Mike and Jimmy, but the rest are mostly shapes moving through the fire. It's a trade-off. Berg wants intensity and chaos in the disaster sequence, and giving every supporting character a fully fleshed-out arc would slow that down. But it does mean that the human tragedy, while powerful, sometimes feels concentrated on a few people, rather than the dozens who were actually involved. Still, even with that limitation, you feel the danger and the stakes. The thinness of some roles doesn't ruin the film, but it's noticeable if you're looking for deeper character moments beyond the two leads. There's no getting around it. Deepwater Horizon uses a lot of familiar disaster movie pieces. You have the ordinary working man at the center of the story, the experienced veteran who knows something is wrong, the corporate guy who keeps pushing because money is louder than common sense, the wife and child waiting back home, the crew full of hardworking people who just want to do their jobs. And then, eventually, the big catastrophic moment where all the warnings finally turn into fire. It's all very recognizable, and depending on how you look at it, that can be a weakness or part of the reason the movie works. Because yes, some of these characters do feel like types. Mike Williams is framed as the dependable blue-collar hero. Jimmy Harrell is the old-school safety conscience. Donald Vidrine is the money-first executive. Felicia is the worried wife on shore. These are not exactly fresh dramatic roles. You can see the movie placing them on the board pretty early. But here's the thing, disaster movies often need that kind of clarity. When everything goes wrong, when smoke fills the screen and people are running through fire, the audience needs emotional shortcuts. We need to know who we trust, who we're angry at, who we're scared for. Deepwater Horizon understands that, maybe a little too well. The problem is that because the film is based on real events, those archetypes feel heavier. These weren't fictional characters invented just to fit a formula. They were real people or based on real people, caught in a real disaster. So when the movie lanes into the hero worker versus greedy corporate man structure, it becomes effective, but also slightly uncomfortable. Real life is usually messier than that. Real people are more complicated than the roles a disaster film gives them. Still, the archetypes do their job. They make the story easy to enter. They give the audience a clean emotional path through a technically complicated event. You may not understand every pressure reading or every drilling term, but you understand a supervisor saying, "This isn't safe." You understand a company man pushing forward anyway. You understand a father trying to survive and get back home. That's why the formula doesn't completely hurt the movie. It simplifies the people, yes, but it also gives the disaster a human shape. And when the rig finally erupts, those familiar roles become anchors inside the chaos. Maybe they're not subtle, but in the middle of fire, mud, alarms, and panic, subtlety is not really what the film is reaching for. Mark Wahlberg's performance in Deepwater Horizon is interesting because it doesn't really ask him to transform. And honestly, that's not a criticism. Wahlberg is playing Mike Williams as a very grounded, practical, blue-collar guy. He's not trying to make him poetic. He's not loading the character with big, dramatic speeches. He's not doing the kind of performance where you can see the actor begging for awards attention. Mike is just a man who knows his job, loves his family, and walks into a workday that slowly turns into a nightmare. That kind of role fits Wahlberg pretty naturally. He has that straightforward screen presence where you believe he can fix something, climb through wreckage, shout over machinery, and still seem like a regular person rather than a polished action hero. There's a simplicity to the performance, but it works for the movie. Mike is not supposed to be mysterious or larger than life. He's supposed to be the audience's anchor, the guy we follow when the technical details get messy and the disaster becomes overwhelming. In the quieter scenes, Wahlberg gives Mike enough warmth to make the family material land. He feels like a husband and father trying to keep life normal before heading back to a dangerous job. Nothing too fancy, nothing overplayed. Just enough, but where he becomes most useful is once the rig starts falling apart. Wahlberg is good at playing panic under control. You can see the fear, but you can also see the training kicking in. Mike doesn't suddenly become some superhero untouched by terror. He looks scared, exhausted, shaken, but still moving because there are people to help and no time to collapse. Now the film does push him into hero territory, maybe a little too much. At times, it feels like the whole disaster is being shaped around Mike's survival arc, when this was obviously a much wider tragedy involving many workers. That's more of a script issue than a performance issue, but it does affect how you read the character. The movie wants him to be the emotional center so badly that some of the ensemble fades behind him. Still, Wahlberg holds that center well. He doesn't give the flashiest performance in the film. Kurt Russell has more authority. John Malkovich is more memorable, but Wahlberg gives Deepwater Horizon something it needs. A steady human viewpoint inside all the fire, mud, noise, and confusion. He may not surprise you here, but he keeps you watching. Kurt Russell is one of the best things about Deepwater Horizon, and not because he's doing anything loud. Actually, that's exactly why he works. As Jimmy Harrell, or Mr. Jimmy, as the crew calls him, Russell brings this heavy, lived-in authority to the film. He feels like a man who has spent years around dangerous machinery, difficult crews, and corporate people who think they understand the job better than the people actually doing it. You believe he knows this rig, you believe he knows the warning signs, and most importantly, you believe the crew would trust him. There's a calmness to Russell here that does a lot of work. He doesn't need to over-explain Jimmy's experience. He carries it in the way he walks into a room, the way he listens, the way his face changes when something doesn't feel right. He has that old-school screen presence where one look can tell you, no, this is serious. And that matters because Jimmy is basically the film's safety conscience. He's the guy asking the questions that should have been asked. He's the guy who doesn't like the shortcuts. He's the guy who can sense that the pressure readings, the missing tests, and BPS impatience are all pointing towards something ugly. When he pushes back, the tension gets sharper because Russell makes that concern feel earned. He doesn't come across as paranoid. he comes across as experienced. There's also a sad irony around him. The film frames him as someone connected to safety and responsibility right before the whole system collapses around him. That contrast gives his character a quiet, tragic weight. He represents the rules, the caution, the professional instinct, and yet even that is not enough when the wrong decisions have already been made above him. Once the explosion hits, Russell doesn't suddenly turn Jimmy into an action figure. He lets him feel hurt, overwhelmed, shaken. That vulnerability is important. It reminds us that even the strongest, most experienced person on that rig is still just a human being trapped inside something uncontrollable. For me, Russell gives the movie a kind of backbone. Mark Wahlberg may be the central viewpoint, and John Malkovich may be the most colorful presence, but Russell is the one who makes the danger feel credible before it becomes visible. He brings weight, and in a film this loud, that quiet weight matters a lot. John Malkovich is easily one of the most memorable parts of Deepwater Horizon, not because his character is likable. He really isn't. Donald Vidrine is basically the face of peace pressure on the rig, the man standing there with corporate confidence while the workers are trying to explain that something feels wrong. He's calm, controlled, and frustrating in that very specific way, where a person sounds reasonable while making absolutely dangerous choices. And Malkovich knows exactly how to play that. He doesn't turn Vidrine into a cartoon villain. That would have been easy. He could have made him louder, nastier, more obvious. But instead, he gives him this quiet arrogance. He speaks slowly. He measures his words. He has that almost slippery confidence of someone who has spent years justifying bad decisions with professional language. That's what makes him irritating in the right way. You can see Vidrine thinking in numbers. Time lost. Money wasted. Schedule pressure. The rig is behind. The company wants results, and from his point of view, every delay feels like a problem to be managed rather than a warning to be respected. He doesn't look at danger the same way the crew does. The workers see risk because they have to physically stand inside it. Vidrine sees inconvenience. Malkovich gives that disconnect a real presence. There's also something strangely pathetic about him as the movie goes on. Early on, he has all the confidence in the room. He pushes, questions, dismisses, explains things away. But once the disaster actually happens, once the fire takes over and the rig becomes chaos, all that corporate certainty means nothing. Suddenly, he's not in control of anything. He's just another man surrounded by consequences. That's where the performance becomes more interesting than the writing around it. The film clearly wants Vidrine to be the villain, and he is. But Malkovich gives him enough texture that he doesn't feel like just a symbol with a name tag. He's slimy, yes. He's money-minded. He's dangerously dismissive. But he also feels like a man trapped in the logic of the company he represents, a logic where shaving time off the job matters more than listening to the people who actually know the rig. And because Malkovich plays him with such controlled confidence, every scene with him has tension. You don't need him to shout. You don't need him to threaten anybody. The danger is in how calm he is. That calmness is what makes him scary, because in Deepwater Horizon, the disaster doesn't begin with fire. It begins with people in charge convincing themselves that the warning signs can be ignored. The supporting cast in Deepwater Horizon has a slightly difficult job. They're not really given the kind of big, polished character arcs that make everyone stand out individually. This isn't a movie where every crew member gets a long backstory, a defining speech, or a perfectly shaped emotional moment. A lot of them are introduced through workplace rhythm, quick conversations, small jokes, tension on the rig, people doing their jobs. And honestly, that makes sense for the kind of movie this is. Gina Rodriguez is one of the stronger supporting presences. She brings a real sense of pressure to the bridge scenes, especially once everything starts collapsing and decisions have to be made fast. You can feel her character trying to stay professional while the situation becomes impossible. There's fear there, but also discipline, and that combination works. Kate Hudson, playing Mike's wife, is in a more familiar role, the spouse waiting back home, slowly realizing something terrible may be happening offshore. It's not the most original part in the world, but she gives it sincerity. Her scenes matter because they remind us that the disaster does not only exist on the rig. Every person out there has someone on land who may be waiting for a phone call that never comes. Dylan O'Brien and the rest of the crew help fill out that working environment. They make the rig feel populated, busy, alive. Even when the film doesn't give each of them enough space to become fully memorable, their presence adds texture. You believe this is a real team, not just three main actors standing in front of machinery. That said, this is where the movie does struggle a bit. Once the explosion happens, the supporting characters can become hard to track. Faces are covered in mud and soot, everyone is running through smoke, and the editing keeps jumping between different areas of the rig. So even when you care about the crew as a whole, you may not always know exactly who is hurt, who is missing, or who just disappeared into the chaos. But maybe that also adds a strange realism. In a disaster like this, people are not always processed as clean individual storylines. Sometimes they are voices in smoke, figures moving through fire, coworkers calling out in panic. The supporting cast helps create that feeling. They may not all get full dramatic weight, but they give the film its sense of community. They make the Deepwater Horizon feel like a workplace full of actual people before it becomes a disaster site. And when everything goes wrong, that matters more than it first seems. When the explosion finally happens in Deepwater Horizon, the movie changes temperature completely. Up to that point, it has been pressure, suspicion, warnings, arguments, technical talk. You can feel something building, but it's still mostly contained inside conversations and machinery. Then the blowout hits, and suddenly the film stops being about what might happen. It becomes about survival. And honestly, this is where the movie is at its most gripping. The disaster doesn't feel clean or choreographed in a pretty way. It's ugly. Mud blasts through the rig, gas spreads, fire erupts, metal tears apart, alarms start screaming. People are thrown into walls, knocked down, covered in oil and debris, trying to understand what just happened before the next thing goes wrong. There's no comfortable pause where the movie lets you breathe and process it all. It just keeps coming. What makes the sequence work is how physical it feels. The rig doesn't explode like some weightless CGI toy. It feels massive, heavy, industrial. Every blast has force behind it. Every burst of flame feels like it could swallow the frame. The mud, the smoke, the heat, the sparks, all of it creates this horrible sense that the environment itself has turned against the people trapped inside it. And because the film spent time showing the rig as a workplace first, the destruction has more impact. This is not just metal being ripped apart. It's a place where people were talking, working, joking, checking gauges, trying to do their jobs. So when the whole structure becomes fire and panic, it hits differently. The second half of the movie is basically one long descent into chaos. Workers are separated, some are injured, some are trying to help others. Some are just trying to find a way off the rig before it becomes impossible. And the film really lanes into that confusion. You feel how fast control disappears. One bad decision becomes a mechanical failure. Mechanical failure becomes an explosion. The explosion becomes a firestorm. And suddenly everyone is reduced to instinct. That's the terrifying thing about the sequence. No matter how experienced these people are, no matter how much they know the rig, once the disaster fully opens up, they're all just human beings inside something far bigger than them. There are moments where the spectacle is almost overwhelming, maybe even too much. The fire, the noise, the running, the debris, it can push right to the edge of exhaustion. But most of the time, that intensity works because the event itself should feel unbearable. It should feel too loud, too hot, too fast. And in those minutes, Deepwater Horizon becomes exactly what it needs to be. Not just a movie about an explosion, but a movie about the instant when warnings become consequences. The disaster sequence is frightening because it feels inevitable, and once it starts, there is no clean way out. The action in Deepwater Horizon is not the clean, fun kind of action. It's not the kind where you sit back and enjoy a big set piece with a bucket of popcorn, smiling because the explosions look expensive. This is uglier than that. Heavier, more uncomfortable. Once the rig goes up, the movie throws you right into the middle of it. Fire is everywhere. Mud is everywhere. Alarms are screaming. Metal is breaking apart. People are running, slipping, coughing, shouting through smoke, trying to find anyone they can still help. And for a while, the film barely lets you breathe. That's where Peter Berg's style really works. He doesn't frame the disaster like a neat action sequence. He makes it feel messy and panicked. You're not observing the rig from a safe distance. You're inside the corridors, on the deck, near the flames, in the dark with people who don't fully know what's happening yet. There's this constant feeling of, where do you even go? Because every escape route seems dangerous, and every few seconds something else collapses, explodes, or catches fire. The immersion is intense. You can almost feel the heat coming off the screen. The sound design does a lot of that work. The blasts, the alarms, the metal groaning, the fire roaring in the background. It turns the disaster into something physical. Not just something you watch, but something that presses down on you. And that's important because the movie is dealing with a real tragedy. The action can't just be cool. It has to feel frightening. It has to feel wrong. It has to remind you that these are not superhero moments. These are workers trapped in a nightmare that should never have happened. There are times when the chaos becomes almost too much. The camera shakes, the editing moves fast. Faces are covered in mud and soot, and you might lose track of who is where. But even that confusion adds to the panic in a strange way. It makes the rig feel uncontrollable, like the whole place has turned into one giant burning maze. And for all its flaws, this is where Deepwater Horizon really earns its impact. The movie doesn't just show destruction. It traps you inside it. One issue with Deepwater Horizon, especially once the disaster really kicks in, is that the chaos sometimes becomes genuinely hard to read. And I get it. In real life, an oil rig exploding in the middle of the ocean would not be neat. It would not be clearly blocked like an action scene where every character gets a perfect hero shot. It would be dark, loud, messy, terrifying. People would be covered in mud, smoke, blood, oil, soot, everything. Nobody would know exactly what was happening in every corner of the rig. The movie captures that feeling almost too well. Once the blowout happens, characters start moving through smoke-filled spaces, firelit corridors, broken metal, alarms, water, mud, and debris. Faces are dirty. Voices are shouted over noise. The camera is constantly moving. The editing jumps between different parts of the rig, different groups of people, different moments of danger. And after a while, you can find yourself thinking, wait, who was that? Where are they now? Did that person make it out? That confusion does create realism. It puts you inside the panic. You feel the disorientation, the loss of control, the sense that the rig has become a burning maze. In those moments, the film is not just showing chaos, it is making you experience it. But there's a downside. When you can't always tell who is injured, who is missing, or where everyone is in relation to the disaster, some of the emotional impact gets blurred. You care about the crew as a whole, absolutely, but individual moments can lose sharpness because the movie is moving so fast and covering everyone in the same layer of smoke and grime. It's a difficult balance. Too much clarity and the disaster might feel staged. Too much confusion, and the audience starts fighting the movie just to understand what they're seeing. Deepwater Horizon lands somewhere in the middle, but it definitely leans toward immersion over clarity. Most of the time, that works because the terror feels immediate. You're not watching from above with a perfect map of the rig. You're down there with them, trying to make sense of disaster 1 second at a time. Still, I do think a few cleaner moments would have helped. Not to make the disaster prettier, not to make it easier, just to make the human stakes hit with a little more precision. Because when the film slows down enough to let us recognize who is in danger, it becomes much more powerful. When it doesn't, the fire is still frightening, but the people inside it can start to blur. Peter Berg's direction in Deepwater Horizon is very much Peter Berg doing what Peter Berg does. He throws you into the middle of a crisis and tries to make you feel it in your chest before you've even had time to fully process it. There's a roughness to his style here, shaky camera, fast cutting, bodies moving through smoke, people shouting over machinery, the whole frame constantly vibrating with pressure. It's not elegant filmmaking exactly, but it is effective filmmaking, and for this story, that matters. Berg understands the physical side of the disaster. He knows how to make the rig feel huge, dangerous, and alive before it starts coming apart. In the first half, he lets the tension simmer through small details, uncomfortable conversations, warning signs, glances between workers, that uneasy feeling when people who know the job start realizing something isn't right. He doesn't rush straight to the fire. He lets the pressure build first. Then once everything goes wrong, he goes full force. The explosion sequence is where his strengths really show. The camera is right there with the crew. You feel the confusion, the noise, the heat, the impossible scale of it all. Berg doesn't turn the disaster into polished action fantasy. He makes it dirty, loud, and frightening. You can feel his interest in ordinary people under extreme pressure, and that gives the film a real pulse. But his direction also has limits. Sometimes the same energy that makes the movie immersive also makes it hard to follow. The camera shakes a little too much. The edits come a little too fast. There are moments where you're not fully sure who is where or what exactly just happened. Berg wants chaos, and he definitely gets chaos, maybe more than the movie can always control. He is also stronger with survival than with reflection. As an action director, he knows how to create momentum. As a director of social commentary, he is more blunt. The film understands corporate greed is dangerous, but it doesn't always dig deeply into the larger consequences. Berg is much more comfortable showing fire, mud, metal, panic, and courage than sitting with the wider environmental or legal aftermath. Still, within the frame he chooses, he directs with conviction. Deepwater Horizon is not a quiet film. It's not subtle. It's not trying to be. Berg makes it immediate, muscular, and emotionally direct. At his best, he makes you feel trapped on that rig with the workers, watching a preventable disaster turn into something uncontrollable. And even when the movie gets messy, you can't accuse it of feeling distant. Berg puts you right in the disaster, sometimes too close, but close enough to make it hurt. What I do appreciate about Deepwater Horizon is that, for the most part, it doesn't treat the disaster like cheap entertainment. That would have been easy to do. A giant oil rig explosion, fire everywhere, people fighting to survive in the middle of the ocean. In the wrong hands, this could have turned into pure spectacle. Just noise, flames, slow-motion hero shots, and dramatic music trying to squeeze emotion out of every second. But the film is a little more careful than that. There's a seriousness in the way Peter Berg approaches the material. He takes his time before the explosion. He lets us sit with the workers, the machinery, the routine of the place. The movie doesn't feel like it's impatiently waiting to blow everything up. It wants you to understand that this was a real workplace before it became a disaster site. That matters, because when the explosion finally comes, it doesn't feel like the movie is celebrating destruction. It feels horrified by it. The fire is huge, the effects are intense, the action is loud, but there's always this unpleasant weight underneath it. These are not fictional action bodies being tossed around for fun. These are people based on real workers, caught in something that should not have happened. The film almost has a docudrama quality in certain stretches. Not fully documentary-like, because it is still very much a Hollywood disaster film, but there's enough procedural detail and workplace texture to make the world feel grounded. You see people doing jobs, arguing over safety checking systems, trying to make sense of readings. The movie respects the fact that this disaster came from a chain of decisions, not just one dramatic boom. And even when the film becomes intense, it usually avoids feeling tasteless. It does not turn the tragedy into a victory lap. The ending, especially, brings the focus back to loss, shock, and the people who did not make it home. There's a tribute quality there that feels sincere. Now, is the film completely free of Hollywood manipulation? No, not at all. It still uses familiar emotional tools. It still has the family scenes, the heroic framing, the music swelling at the right moments. But compared to what this could have been, Deepwater Horizon shows a surprising amount of restraint. It wants to grip you, absolutely. But it also wants you to remember that this happened. And that difference keeps the movie from feeling like disaster tourism. One of the first things that hits you when the disaster unfolds in Deepwater Horizon is just how effective the visuals are. The CGI and practical effects work together to create something that feels massive, terrifying, and most importantly, believable. The rig isn't some floating toy in a green screen. You feel the weight of it, the way fire spreads, the way smoke and mud move through the corridors. It's big, industrial, and dangerous, and the effects sell that. Berg doesn't go overboard with flashy CGI tricks. It's not about style over substance. The computer-generated effects mostly enhance what's already happening on set. A firestorm that rages, explosions that feel like they could knock the ceiling down, mud and debris flying through the air. It's messy, chaotic, and realistic. That's what makes the sequence so terrifying. You can almost feel the heat on your skin, and it's not just the destruction itself. The visuals help tell the story of survival. You see smoke-filled corridors, flames eating through metal, lifeboats swinging in chaos. You can follow the crew, at least most of the time, and the environment feels like a character itself. It's constantly shifting, unpredictable, and deadly, which makes every decision the crew makes feel urgent. That said, the effects aren't perfect. Sometimes, in the thick of all the explosions and mud, it's hard to tell exactly who is where, which can make the chaos a little disorienting. But maybe that's intentional. After all, in a real disaster, things aren't clear or easy to follow. The confusion adds to the immersion, even if it occasionally makes you squint at the screen. Overall, the visual effects and CGI in Deepwater Horizon strike a good balance. They're big, they're messy, they're intense, but they don't steal the story. Instead, they serve it, making the disaster feel immediate, physical, and frighteningly real. It's one of the areas where the movie really earns its intensity. The sound in Deepwater Horizon does a lot more than just make the explosions louder. And honestly, this is one of the film's strongest technical pieces. The movie is built around pressure, and the sound design makes you feel that pressure before you even fully understand it. Machines hum, metal groans, alarms sit in the background, voices overlap in control rooms. There's always something mechanical happening somewhere, almost like the rig itself is breathing. Then, when the disaster hits, the sound becomes brutal. The explosions don't feel clean, they feel heavy, like something massive has torn open. Fire roars across the rig, alarms scream over each other, steel bends and breaks, people shout through smoke and chaos, and every blast seems to shake the whole movie. It's not just noise for noise's sake, it creates panic. It makes the space feel dangerous. You can feel why the film got attention in the technical categories, because the sound is doing emotional work. It keeps you tense. It makes the rig feel alive before the explosion, and then wounded after it. There are moments where you almost don't need dialogue because the environment is telling you everything. The machinery is failing, the situation is slipping away, and nobody has control anymore. The music is more restrained than you might expect. It doesn't constantly try to force emotion down your throat. It supports the tension, sits underneath the dread, and then rises when the film needs that emotional push. Sometimes, yes, the score leans into familiar disaster movie feeling, especially near the more sentimental moments. But most of the time, it knows when to stay behind the fire, the alarms, and the human panic. That's important because a movie like this could easily become overscored. Too much music would make the tragedy feel polished, almost heroic in the wrong way. But Deepwater Horizon works best when the soundscape feels raw, when the machinery, the blasts, and the silence after impact carry the scene. And those quieter moments matter too. After so much noise, a sudden drop in sound can hit harder than another explosion. A pause, a breath, a survivor trying to process what just happened, that's where the movie reminds you this isn't just spectacle. It's trauma, so yes, the visuals are impressive, but the sound is what really traps you on that rig. It's loud, harsh, messy, and terrifying, exactly the way it should be. The way Deepwater Horizon looks is a big part of why it feels so intense. The cinematography really sells the scale of the rig. You get wide shots that show just how massive the platform is, but you also get close-up, almost claustrophobic angles that make you feel trapped in corridors filled with smoke, mud, and fire. It's a smart balance. You see the enormity of the disaster while still feeling the individual human stakes. Editing plays a huge role, too. Berg moves quickly between different areas of the rig, the crew trying to escape, the BP execs making bad decisions, even people on shore waiting for news. It's fast, sometimes chaotic, and occasionally you can get a little lost, but that's kind of the point. You're not meant to have a perfect map of the disaster. You're meant to feel the confusion, the panic, the unpredictability. And then there's the production design. The rig feels lived in. You can see small details, equipment, control panels, toolboxes, the way the crew moves through their spaces. It's messy, industrial, and convincing. You believe people actually work here. That texture makes the disaster sequence hit harder because you're not just watching CGI fire on a soundstage. You're watching a fully realized workplace being torn apart. There are moments where it's a little overwhelming. So many moving pieces, smoke, fire, people running. It can be hard to track exactly who's where. But that again reinforces immersion. It's chaotic in the right way because real disasters are chaotic. The camera and editing don't sanitize that. Overall, the visuals, the editing rhythm, and the set design combine to make the rig feel tangible, massive, and dangerous. You're not just watching a movie about an explosion, you're inside it. You can almost feel the heat, the weight of metal, the smell of smoke. And that's exactly what a film like this needs to do to make you care. What really sticks with you in Deepwater Horizon isn't just the explosions or the fire. It's the emotional weight the film carries beneath all that chaos. The movie knows these aren't fictional characters. These were real people, doing real work, and some of them didn't make it home. That knowledge seeps into every scene. Even when the crew is joking around, checking gauges, or moving through the routine of the rig, there's this undercurrent of tension. You're aware that danger is real, and that awareness makes every small interaction, a glance, a raised eyebrow, a hurried check, emotionally charged. Once the disaster hits, the film ramps up the intensity, and yes, there's a bit of melodrama. Music swells, family connections are emphasized, faces contort in fear and pain. But it generally works because it's grounded in stakes we understand. We've already invested in these people. We know their routines. We've seen them care about each other. So when the rig burns and people are struggling to survive, those moments hit hard. It's not a subtle movie, and it doesn't pretend to be. It wants you to feel the panic, the heroism, the fear, and the grief all at once. Some scenes are almost too calculated in their emotional impact. You can feel the film nudging you toward sadness or suspense, but because the events themselves are so horrifying, the nudge feels natural. The emotional core also comes from the human relationships. Mike Williams trying to survive for his family, Jimmy Harold trying to save his crew, the workers looking out for one another. These connections make the disaster personal. They transform the explosions from spectacle into tragedy. By the end, the film doesn't just leave you with a visual memory of fire and smoke. It leaves a feeling, a mix of heartbreak, respect, and frustration that stays with you. And in a story about preventable disaster, that lingering emotional impact is just as important as any CGI firestorm. Deepwater Horizon might lean on some melodrama, but it earns it. It's raw, it's human, and it makes you feel the tragedy in a way that lingers long after the credits roll. One of the most powerful parts of Deepwater Horizon is how it honors the 11 men who lost their lives. This isn't just a disaster movie spectacle. Berg makes it clear, even in the midst of explosions and chaos, that these were real people. You get glimpses of their personalities, their routines, the way they interact with coworkers. And when the rig starts breaking apart, the stakes become heartbreakingly clear. These are not faceless extras. They're human beings with families, with hopes, with lives cut tragically short. The film doesn't linger on them for excessive screen time, but it makes sure you feel the weight of their absence. When the fire rages and people are scrambling for survival, there's an underlying knowledge that some of these men will not make it. That tension gives every close call, every heroic attempt, an emotional punch. Even in the quieter moments, the movie reminds you that these deaths mattered. The camaraderie of the crew before the disaster, the personal stakes, the reactions of families waiting on shore, all of it reinforces that this tragedy was intensely personal. By the end, the tribute feels earned. The closing moments, the way the disaster is framed, and the subtle acknowledgments of the victims all make it clear that this film is meant to remember and honor the people behind the headlines. It's a reminder that the fire, the mud, the explosions, they're not just thrilling visuals. They're a reflection of real lives lost. And that gives Deepwater Horizon an emotional weight that sticks with you long after the screen goes black. One thing Deepwater Horizon doesn't shy away from is showing that surviving the rig doesn't mean the nightmare ends. After the explosions, the fire, the mud, and the chaos, the survivors are left alive, but shaken, exhausted, and haunted. The movie does a good job of letting that sink in. You see them coughing, covered in grime, looking around in disbelief. They've escaped physically, but the emotional weight is crushing. Berg doesn't linger on therapy sessions or melodramatic speeches, but he gives small moments that speak volumes. A glance at a friend who didn't make it. A pause when a worker realizes just how close he came to death. The quiet aftermath where everyone is trying to process what happened. Those little details make the trauma feel real. It's a reminder that survival comes with its own cost. These men didn't walk away unscathed. The fire and destruction are only the beginning. What stays with them is fear, guilt, and shock, the kind of feelings that don't disappear when you leave the rig behind. That focus on survivor trauma makes the disaster more human. It's not just about fire and explosions anymore. It's about people carrying the memory of those who died, and the fact that even the lucky ones have scars, emotional ones that last a lifetime. In a way, those quieter, painful moments after the chaos are just as powerful as the action itself. They remind you why the story matters, because the tragedy doesn't end with the flames. It lives on in the people who were there, and Berg doesn't let us forget that. One of the bigger criticisms of Deepwater Horizon is what the movie doesn't fully show, the environmental disaster. The explosion and fire are front and center, and the human tragedy is clear, but the oil spill itself, the long-term damage to the Gulf of Mexico, the wildlife, the coastline, all of that is barely touched. There's an oil-stained bird here, a few brief reminders that the spill is happening beyond the rig, but mostly the film stays focused on the people on board. That's a choice, and I get it. The story is primarily about the rig crew and their struggle to survive, but it does leave you wanting a little more context. This was not just a workplace tragedy. It was one of the worst ecological disasters in American history. Millions of gallons of oil spread through the Gulf, impacting marine life, fishermen, and coastal communities for years. And while the movie hints at that, it never digs in. It's almost like the human story was easier to dramatize. Fire, smoke, explosions, heroism, that's cinematic. The environmental aftermath is slower, harder to visualize, and messier to dramatize. But that doesn't make it less real or less important. So while Deepwater Horizon nails the tension, the chaos, and the human heroism, it leaves out the lasting scars on the Gulf itself. That omission can feel jarring because you're aware, in the back of your mind, that the consequences extended far beyond the rig. In other words, the movie makes you feel the heat, the fire, the mud, and the loss of life, but it doesn't fully make you feel the oil. And that's a piece of the story that lingers in your head long after the credits roll. Another thing Deepwater Horizon mostly leaves on the table is what happened after the flames went out. And that's frustrating, because the movie spends so much time showing us how BP's decisions helped lead to the disaster, but then it barely follows that thread into the aftermath. We get the explosion, we get the survival, we get the grief, but the legal mess, the corporate accountability, the public fallout, all of that is treated more like background information than part of the drama. And honestly, there was a whole other movie sitting right there. The courtroom battles, the compensation claims, the executives trying to protect themselves, the workers and families trying to get answers. The company statements, the blame shifting, the pressure to control the narrative, that material could have added a completely different kind of tension. This is a big, expensive, technically impressive disaster film with a strong cast, a real-life tragedy behind it, and some genuinely powerful filmmaking. You'd think that combination would make it an easy hit. But the movie didn't really become that. It had the scale of a major studio release, but the box office response was softer than expected. and honestly, I can understand why. This is not exactly a fun night out kind of disaster movie. It has the explosions, sure. It has the fire, the chaos, the survival tension. But the whole thing is tied to a recent real-world tragedy. People died. The Gulf was damaged. BP was still strongly associated with anger, lawsuits, and environmental devastation in the public mind. So the movie had blockbuster packaging, but the subject matter was heavy. That's a tricky sell. Financially, it cost a lot to make, and while it did bring in money worldwide, it wasn't enough to make it feel like the success the studio probably wanted. For a film built with this much technical ambition, that underperformance stings a bit. You can see the money on screen. The rig, the fire, the effects, the sound, the scale of destruction, none of it feels cheap. But expensive craft does not always guarantee a huge audience, especially when the story is this uncomfortable. Where the film did get proper recognition was in the technical categories, and that makes perfect sense. Whatever you think of the pacing, the character depth, or the missing aftermath, the sound and visual effects are hard to dismiss. The explosion has weight, the fire feels dangerous. The metal, mud, alarms, smoke, and pressure all come together to create a disaster sequence that feels physical and punishing. That's the kind of work awards bodies tend to notice, because it is not just decorative. It is central to the experience of the film. The Oscar nominations for its technical work feel earned. This is a movie where the craft is doing a huge amount of storytelling. The sound makes the rig feel alive before it becomes a nightmare. The effects make the destruction feel massive without turning it into empty spectacle. The technical side is probably the film's most universally defensible strength, so the awards and box office tell two different stories. As a business gamble, Deepwater Horizon struggled. As a piece of technical filmmaking, it absolutely made an impression. And that feels about right for the movie overall. Not a perfect film, not a massive crowd pleaser, but a serious, intense, well-crafted disaster drama whose strongest achievements are felt in the heat, the noise, and the terrifying scale of the catastrophe. When Deepwater Horizon works, it really works. The biggest strength is the intensity. Once the disaster begins, the movie grabs you by the collar and doesn't give you much room to settle. The fire, the mud, the alarms, the collapsing metal, the panic spreading across the rig, it all feels immediate in a way that a lot of disaster movies try to achieve, but don't always manage. You don't just watch the chaos from a distance, you feel pushed into it, and that's where the technical craft becomes such a major asset. The sound design is brutal in the best way. Every explosion has weight, every alarm cuts through the scene. The rig sounds alive before the disaster, then wounded after it. The visual effects are also strong, not because they're flashy, but because they feel physical. The destruction has texture, the fire feels hot, the mud feels thick. The whole rig feels like a real place being torn apart, not just a digital playground built for spectacle. The performances help ground all of that. Mark Wahlberg gives the film a steady center. He's believable as a regular working man caught in something far bigger than himself. Kurt Russell brings real authority as Jimmy Harrell, and honestly, every time he's on screen, the movie feels more solid. John Malkovich gives the film its sharpest tension as Donald Vidrine, playing corporate arrogance with this calm, almost irritating confidence that makes you want to reach through the screen and stop the conversation. Another strength is the way the film builds dread before the explosion. Even when the first half moves slowly, it does create that sense of pressure building under the surface. You know something is wrong. The crew knows something is wrong. And the people who should be listening are too busy thinking about time, money, and scheduled delays. That makes the disaster feel less like a random accident and more like the terrible result of ignored warnings. The movie also has respect for the real people involved. It doesn't treat the event like cheap entertainment. Yes, it's loud and intense, and yes, it has the shape of a Hollywood disaster film, but underneath that, there's a sincere tribute to the workers who died and the survivors who carried the trauma afterward. That emotional respect matters, because the best thing about Deepwater Horizon is that it understands the disaster was not just fire on the water or headlines about BP. It was a workplace full of people, people with families, people trying to do their jobs, people who trusted that safety would matter more than speed. And when the film remembers that, it becomes more than just a well-made disaster movie. It becomes genuinely affecting. For all the things Deepwater Horizon does well, it definitely has some rough edges. The first one is the pacing. The opening half takes its time, maybe a little too much time. I understand why the movie does it. It wants to establish the crew, the rig, the pressure from BP, the warning signs, all of that. But there are stretches where the film feels stuck in setup mode. People are talking about tests, schedules, pressure readings, cement, equipment, and you can feel the movie trying to be accurate, but accuracy doesn't always mean gripping. And that leads into the second problem, the jargon. There is a lot of technical language here, and not all of it lands cleanly. Sometimes you understand the emotional meaning of a scene, something is wrong, the crew is worried, BP is pushing too hard, but you don't always understand the exact mechanics. Why this test matters, why that reading is alarming, why one explanation is dangerous and another one is acceptable. The film gives you enough to feel the tension, but not always enough to fully follow the logic. Then once the disaster begins, the problem almost flips. The slow first half becomes a frantic second half, and while the chaos is intense, it can also be hard to read. Everyone is covered in mud, soot, smoke, blood, and oil. The camera shakes, the editing jumps around, characters run through dark spaces, and after a while it becomes difficult to tell who is where, who is hurt, and who has made it out. That confusion does create realism, but it also blurs some of the human impact. Another issue is the character development. Mike, Jimmy, and Vidrine stand out clearly, but a lot of the supporting crew members don't get enough room to become fully memorable. You care about them because the situation is real and horrifying, but as written characters, many of them feel thin. The film wants the rig to feel like a community, and it mostly does, but not every person in that community gets a strong identity. The BP side is also handled in a very direct way. Corporate greed is the villain, and honestly the movie is not wrong to be angry about that, but the moral framing can feel a bit too clean. Workers good, BP bad. Safety ignored, disaster follows. That makes for effective drama, but it also simplifies a larger and more complicated failure. And then there's the biggest weakness, the aftermath. The movie spends so much energy on the explosion and survival that it barely deals with the environmental devastation, the Gulf Coast damage, the legal fallout, or the corporate accountability that followed. For a disaster of this size, that absence is hard to ignore. The film shows the fire, but not enough of the oil. It shows the night of the catastrophe, but not enough of the long shadow it cast afterward. So the weaknesses don't ruin Deepwater Horizon, but they do keep it from feeling complete. It is powerful in the moment. It is technically impressive. It is often emotional. But it also leaves you thinking there was a bigger, messier, more important story just outside the frame. So here's the bottom line on Deepwater Horizon. This isn't a perfect film. It has rough patches. The first half can feel slow, weighed down by technical talk and exposition. Some of the supporting characters aren't fully fleshed out, and it largely skips over the environmental and legal aftermath, which is a huge part of the real story. There's jargon, some confusion in the chaos, and a moral simplicity that doesn't capture the full complexity of what really happened. But despite all that, the movie hits hard where it matters most. Once the disaster strikes, Berg's direction, the sound, the visuals, and the performances combine to create one of the most visceral, immersive, and terrifying sequences you're likely to see on screen. The fire, the mud, the smoke, the heat, it's almost tangible. And amidst all that chaos, the human drama is front and center. Wahlberg grounds the story as the everyman you can relate to. Russell brings authority and gravitas. Malkovich embodies the corporate negligence that makes the tragedy inevitable. And the supporting crew, even if thinly drawn, makes the rig feel real, populated, lived in. The movie earns its emotional punch, too. You feel the weight of the 11 lives lost, the trauma carried by the survivors, and the tension of every decision that could make the difference between life and death. It's not subtle, it's not quiet, but it's honest, gripping, and in its own way, respectful of the people who went through this real-life horror. Ultimately, Deepwater Horizon is a strong disaster film with a human heart. It's immersive, intense, and technically impressive. It's flawed, yes, and it leaves out parts of the bigger story. But if you're looking for a film that puts you on a rig in crisis, makes you care about the people caught inside it, and doesn't shy away from the chaos, this one delivers. It's not a masterpiece, but it's a harrowing, compelling, and unforgettable ride, one that lingers long after the flames have died down.